So here we are, episode 20, you were saying.
20 now. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, excellent.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about the month delay, folks.
Yes, that one was
Sometimes
my
these
fault. I just wasn't really feeling very well a couple of weeks ago, and then we couldn't schedule it in the intermediate period. So here we are, 4 weeks later. Instead of 2
Absolutely.
weeks later.
Right. All right. So, and as you can see, I'm in a completely new setting right now. I've moved locations. I'm in a new apartment now. So, new office space, new lot of things, new chair, new beginning, hopefully. So,
Oh, very good. No worries. Still the same city?
yes.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Mm.
No worries. Yes. All right. Well, I've got a couple of items. We actually didn't talk about it beforehand. I don't know if you have any particular areas you wanted to talk about today, Vernon.
No, I'm quite fresh. Obviously you're more prepared than I am. So.
No worries. I've actually been working on a couple of things over the last few weeks, and it's actually kind of often the case when we're thinking about things to talk about. Sometimes there are things that turn up in the media and so forth, but other times there's nothing sort of specific that's particularly interesting. And I'm often working on different areas, and a couple that I was working on this time are actually men's spaces. So that's one that I've been looking at, and for a particular reason, which I'll get to in a sec. And the other one is something very close to my heart, the feminist historical narrative. So my book's moving along, and I'm basically working on the area that talks about the feminist historical narrative. And this has actually been linking into a few other things that have been going on. One of our friends, Peter Wright, is also very active in historical research as well, and he's been turning up some really interesting stuff actually, which we've been chatting about online, and some of the stuff I've made records to talk about those areas a little bit more in the book as well. But so feminist historical narrative and men's spaces. I want to tell you about how this came about with men's spaces. So as we know, feminists are really kind of up in arms at the moment about women, about men, and in particular trans women, going into women's spaces. And it's interestingly, they've been saying that a lot of the the trans movement is coming out of men's rights, which is really interesting because it actually comes straight out of intersectionality, which of course is part of modern feminism. So they've brought intersectionality into feminism, and then they've lost control of it essentially, and now they're blaming us for it. Anyway, so as part of this discussion, the topic of men's spaces came up, and I happened to mention on a Twitter comment. I just happened to mention on Twitter that I said men's spaces have been invaded for 50 years, and that's why a lot of men aren't especially worried about women's spaces being invaded now. We're kind of not really doing much about it. There's a bit of outrage among some men, but most men are like, well, we've been putting up with this for 50 years. This is what feminism brings you, So anyway, oddly enough, a couple of people actually said to me, "Oh, what's this about?" I'm paraphrasing here. What's this about men's spaces? I particularly use the term men's spaces being under attack. And one gentleman said, men's spaces under attack with 4 question marks. And another woman came in and she thought that was a bit odd too. So although most of us, I would say, it's fairly obvious to most people that men's spaces have been under attack. And I will have put in here that many feminists admit this is true, that this has been going on. Many feminists, if you actually read about people talk about this online, many feminists will concede it has been happening. But there are a few people who amazingly have apparently missed this. So anyway, I realised that Wikifemin was actually a little bit deficient on this topic. So because I just assumed everybody realised it was true. So I've actually started, the last few weeks I've been working on, 2 weeks particularly, I've been working on this quite a bit and putting more entries in regarding men's spaces being invaded.
Right. So this is going to be the idiot's guide to male space invasion.
It's getting a bit that way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One of the people who denied that men's spaces are being invaded called me a thicko, which was I suppose that's somewhat less insulting than being called stupid or a moron or something. I thought that was at least a funny one.
Right.
But anyway, so it did prompt me to put as you say, it's a bit of an idiot's guide to this, because most of us, as I said, even most feminists now can see this is something that has been going on for decades. So here we are. It's far from finished, but I did actually come up with a few that I probably wasn't really aware of. So it's quite interesting to look at some of the places that women have entered men's spaces. And so I do want to say too that my view, and I've said this many, many times over the last decade in particular when I've been involved in men's rights, my view is simply both or neither. If we as a society decide that single-sex spaces aren't something that's acceptable, okay. But if on the other hand we decide that they are needed, well, we need to have men's spaces and women's spaces. And that's the position that I will have. And somehow I'll be called a misogynist for making that argument, but there it is.
That's right. And that's kind of a similar enough position that I would have. I would actually say, as far as that, depending on private institutions, have your male spaces, have your female spaces, have your specifically mixed spaces. Just be consistent about it. Just be
exactly
no double standards. Actually establish them. Have people free associate, so there'll be no hypocrisy.
That's right. And if there's a women's organization at a university, then that university should, if the men wish to do so, they should also be able to create a men's organization. And I don't even say it has to be mandatory. It may be that the men at a particular university decide not to create such an organization. That's fine too. Right. But if they wish to create one, they should be able to. There was a case that I think it was, I'll hesitantly say it was University of Sydney. I think it was University of Sydney, but I don't quote me on that, and I may have to. I'll see if I can check that. But anyway, there was a student union organisation. It's very common. All Australian universities have these organisations, and they're often quite well funded. There's often mandatory student unionism here. Well, that's actually been going away, but for a long time there's been mandatory student unionism. They're quite well funded. Anyway, this particular student union had 3 men and 2 women on the board. And so they made all the decisions for this. An organisation that can have hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, in their budget. So anyway, the men at the university, a group of men, applied for a men's group, and there were, of course, a number of women's groups at this university. Mm-hmm. And when it came time to decide to vote whether this group would be accepted or not, remember, 3 women and 2 men on the board. The 2 men, I kid you not, suddenly realized they had prior appointments, both of them, in the middle of the meeting, just noticed that they had prior commitments that they needed to be at, excused themselves from the meeting. Now, there was still quorum because the 3 women made quorum, and the men's organisation was voted down. Yeah, that happened 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit more now. I'll look up I'm pretty sure it was University of Sydney, but I will look up the exact location that occurred. But it was almost comical about the way it happened, and how they meant, look at the time. I forgot to be. I've got this thing I need to be at, and they got up and left the meeting. All the other business was dealt with. They just had this last thing to do, and they left. Anyway, yes,
right.
I laughed, but it was ridiculous. Because it was ridiculous. So yeah, I hadn't previously put that one in my notes. Actually, that just came to mind while we're talking now. But that was several years ago that I saw that happen, and I mentioned it at the time in various online forums. But anyway, yes, I'll make sure that's on Wiki for Men as well.
Sounds good.
So there's a few others. Some actually. So I was one of the things I was looking at is whether this really started in the 1960s or 1970s. Sources varied in their opinion on this, and I've decided that it was pretty much the 1960s at this point. Some reports in the media will say 1970s. I guess it was just getting going in the 60s, but there are definitely some documented cases. Yale College, which is part of Yale University, it's went coeducational in 1969. So Yale College I've got this on Wiki for Men. Yale College is an undergraduate college at the Yale University. So, I mean, it's common in British universities too. There will be a number of colleges that are associated, they will operate under the banner of a single university, but they are often quite autonomous. But anyway, so Yale College, was men only from 1701 to 1969. Then it became coeducational. Now, interestingly, at Yale University, there are 3 very well-known secret societies. Not so secret anymore, but I think the membership is still there's still quite a limitations on knowing the current membership. But those are Scroll and Key, Skull and Bones, and Wolf's Head, and a lot of American politicians are members of those organizations. Now, if I remember,
Skull and Bones, I've heard of some.
Yeah, Skull and Bones. So apparently, I think Skull and Bones was the original one. Now, at one point, both candidates for the U.S. election, for presidential election, for Democrat and Republican, were both members of Skull and Bones.
Right.
So to give you an idea of, you were bound to get a Skull and Bones president, right? That was George W. Bush, I think, from memory.
Yes, I'm pretty sure he was there.
Yeah. And so anyway, so it's interesting how it does cross party lines, and it's interesting how many influential Americans are members of one of these organizations. But anyway, all of these organizations were I guess admitted women at around the same time. The first one, Skull and Key, was 1988. Then Skull and Bones in 1991, and Wolf's Head, the third organization, 1992. So all three went in. So my view there, yes, is they're very sort of, I guess, quite powerful organizations in the sense that they're quite influential, but there really was nothing stopping women forming a similar organization. But instead, they've come into all the three men's organizations, and that's pretty typical. In the United Kingdom in 1981, we had, and jump in any time. I've got a bit of a list here, but feel free to jump in any time, Vernon.
Sure.
Otherwise, I'll just keep going down my list.
Right.
There's the Reform Club. So the Reform Club's actually really famous because it's actually the place that the book, now I'm having a bit of a mental blank on the book, 80 Days Around the World.
Mm-hmm.
I'll get the exact title here.
Sure.
Around the World in 80 Days. Around the World in 80 Days, and the mental blank, actually starts and ends at the Reform Club, I believe. And so it's quite interesting that that's one that actually turned up quickly in my research. So the Reform Club admitted women in 1981. Lions International admitted women as members in 1987. Rotary in 1989. Now, there's a club called the United Oxford and Cambridge Club, 1996. I haven't completed my research. I want to put as many of these organisations in as possible, large organisations, and are really cases where women could have formed a parallel organisation, but didn't, and instead went into the men's organisation. Some fairly famous examples. 2018, girls were allowed to become Cub Scouts. So, of course, this meant that girls were now allowed in the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts.
Right.
At the entry level, the Cubs level, which I believe the Girl Scouts had complained about because it was actually drawing their membership away. Well, this is, I think there were probably many people in the Boy Scouts who would have happily retained it as a single-sex organisation. But along those lines, women were allowed into certain parts of scouting as far back as 1970. They were allowed into venturing, sea scouting, and explorers programs. And from memory, that was because that there were no equivalent programs, I think, but for women. But then again, they could have been created. But the women were allowed into the men's programs. Those are, I don't know if you're familiar with scouting much, but those are more senior. Those are older people. Yeah, for the boys, they would have been involved in scouting probably right the way through to be as far as venturing. So the girls were allowed in. But one particularly notable example, in 1978, female reporters, this has come up in discussions a bit recently, female reporters were allowed into changing rooms to interview male professional athletes in the United States, which I thought was a particularly interesting one. Mm-hmm. So you've got women going into men's locker rooms there, and it's still the case, as far as I know, that male reporters cannot go into female locker rooms to interview important female athletes. So, now there's one here in Queensland where I live. There's a club called the Tattersalls Club. It's a men's only club, and admitted women in 2019. Now, I did check. There are a number of these men's-only clubs in Australia. It's very much a British model of having these clubs. Most of them actually still are men only, but I suspect many of them probably won't remain it for too much longer. A lot of them have had votes to admit women, and the vote has been narrowly defeated in a lot of cases. But it's very likely that we'll see a lot of these clubs become not just men's clubs in the future. But here's the thing, and this comes back to what I was saying about men's clubs and women's clubs, or men's organisations and women's organisations. Here in Queensland, there's a club called the Moreton Club, which is a women's only club, which is even more exclusive than Tattersalls Club, and is women only and remains women only. As far as I know, there's been no vote or push to admit men into Tattersalls Club, and this is typically true, of course, of women's organisations. And there are many more, of course. There are women's spaces for workspaces, for example, shared work environments and so forth. There's quite a number of those around now, particularly in the US. There's been some interesting stuff there about men trying to get into them, and I believe they have had some limited access in getting into them.
Exactly.
But yeah, men's spaces have been invaded consistently for decades. Oh, one last one I just wanted to mention: men's sheds. Men's sheds is something that started in Australia, but does operate in a number of other countries now. They started as places for men, that were quite literally sheds for men to go and work with their hands and produce stuff. And a lot of men's sheds produce toys and stuff, wooden toys and stuff for kids who are underprivileged, and do stuff like that. And there really has been a push for women to enter men's sheds. This is something Bettina Art here in Australia has really pushed back against, and she's done some really great stuff there, raising awareness of that. Again, and so now they've got sometimes there are women's days in men's sheds. And I think some of them still have men's days, whereas there are some that are just unified. And the argument is that there are things that men won't say in front of women, and that the idea of these environments is while they're working and doing stuff, they're also free to talk about anything they want to talk about. And a lot of people say these were really successful environments that are not available to men anymore.
Exactly. Now, it's actually kind of dawning to me why these people, like your person who reacted to your, men's spaces invaded. What the hell are you talking about? It's because they never had that semblance of male spaces to begin with. As far as they're concerned, it never did exist. So it doesn't exist to be invaded. That's why they're kind of flummoxed at this thing. They don't have any sense of identity regarding that. Having a male space, that's a completely alien concept to them. That's why they don't even sense it being invaded to begin with.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's because they wouldn't even think that this is something that would be a problem. So yes,
exactly. Yeah.
So I'm going to continue researching on men's spaces, and the list will be getting a lot longer. But there is a list on Wiki for Men under the article men's spaces, and I have immortalized the conversation on Twitter. So you'll see it there, which probably prompted me to produce the article. So I thought I'll just going to take a screenshot of that and put it there.
Sounds
the
good.
entire conversation is public, so there's no problem with doing that.
Sure.
But, there it is.
Right.
The other item I have is feminist historical narratives. I said something close to my heart. I don't know if you've got any further thoughts on men's spaces or on any other topics before I jump in.
Well, as any of our listeners know, we've been beating this drum for quite a bit, right? This is not the first episode we've talked about the subject. We've been beating the drum on this one for several episodes in a row, probably. And, as evidenced by this kind of reaction that we get when we talk about this kind of stuff, even from conservative idiots, as well as the liberal idiots, we need to have a better guide for those idiots. And I think Robert's going to be doing more on this one. So it'll be pretty evident for them.
Absolutely. As I said, Peter Wright's also doing a lot on it. And it's quite interesting, actually. I'm really happy to see this is an area that people are talking a lot more about. The reason I talk so much about it is because modern feminism is very much grounded in the feminist historical narrative. A lot of their claims about why they act the way they do, because many of the things that feminists do are completely outrageous, right? And so, and even they realize that. So they have to justify it. And they justify it through the feminist historical narrative. And they say, we're acting this way because women were oppressed for thousands of years or forever or whatever. They disagree, by the way, on exactly how long women have been oppressed. But they all agree that they've been oppressed historically. And so they use that as justification. And so that's why I believe we must really attack the feminist historical narrative to undermine it. And because feminism rests on top of it, feminism will fall. Of course, as we've said before, feminism isn't the be-all and end-all, and there's gynocentrism out there that is not feminist in nature. There's traditional gynocentrism and so forth. So, but in terms of at least attacking feminism, which is still a relatively powerful entity, I think this is probably a valuable way to do it. As I said, I'm very happy that so many people are now talking about this stuff, because when I really decided to write, I haven't finished writing my book yet, although I'm close. When I started to write it, I felt not many people were talking about it. And a lot of the material that I release is stuff that I have developed along the way while writing the book. So I hope to complete the book within the next few months, finally, and publish the first edition. But what I'll most likely do is, for a long time, I was kept adding information to it, which is what was delaying it. So I drew a line in the sand about a year ago and said, that's it. Anything else will be in the second edition or a later edition. So basically, at this point, I just have to complete the current material and then publish, and then there'll be another second edition within a year or two. But I want to get something out there because it's an important area and it's becoming more and more relevant. People are discussing it more and more. So
yeah. And I think it's worth kind of going into the psychology about why men do this, besides just habit, just deference to women. We had to kind of go as to why they don't think male spaces even deserve to exist, because I think that's kind of an underlying sentiment about this.
It's very interesting. That's right, exactly. A lot of people, as we know, they haven't even it hasn't even occurred to them, or for one reason or another, they think that male spaces don't need to exist. And I think at least some of that comes down to them buying into the feminist historical narrative. And I like to say that, and I've said this many times, the feminist historical narrative is so pervasive that even many anti-feminists buy into it. You'll hear people say, the thousands of years that women were oppressed is not justification for the way that feminists are acting now.
Right. Yeah.
So they're accepting the premise of the argument that
exactly
that were oppressed, but
the first few waves of feminism were so good. They had a purpose.
Right. Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And we tend to disagree with that. That's right. Exactly. It was pretty rotten from the start. And look at the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments. I mean, that was 1848, and they were already openly criticizing men.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've got a few areas under the feminist historical narrative at the moment. The ancient matriarchy. So I think we have touched on this before, but I want to clarify, even most feminists don't believe in the ancient matriarchy anymore. But there are still some that do. And I am happy to say that most feminists who understand this, I've heard of this, because a lot of feminists haven't even heard of it, but among the ones who have, most of them realize it's not true. But it was something that was pushed particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. And I love pointing out that the concept of the ancient matriarchy was invented by a man.
Very simpish man, probably.
What's that, sorry?
A very simpish sort of man, probably.
Yeah, well, he was 19th century, and I guess probably had a different viewpoint on it, but I think in a modern sense, we'd probably call it fairly simpish, yes. So his name was Johann Jakob Bachofen, and he basically developed this idea in the 19th century, which was then widely accepted among European men, intellectuals, I should say, and then was later picked up, from starting about the 1950s, was picked up by feminists and turned into this. Well, it was essentially the same idea, but I mean, they then popularized it among other feminists. And so that idea was then pretty well known up until set up about the 1990s. Even in the 1990s, I was hearing feminists talk about this quite a bit. And I didn't know as much about it then as I do now. And even those days, the idea seemed pretty suspect to me. But now I'm having spent a considerable amount of time researching, I can say it's utter tosh. It really is.
Of course.
And it's based on the idea, and this is pretty laughable actually. The whole thing is predicated on the notion that ancient humans didn't know about the connection between sex and pregnancy. Because the argument is that once humans discovered this connection, men's position in society elevated and the patriarchy was created. But they're actually, what a low opinion they have of ancient humans. They're claiming that they didn't know that sex got women pregnant.
Right.
They
Well,
actually say this.
well, the analogy of seed and soil was pretty ancient anyway, right? Like, because they've used that analogy before.
And
So,
my argument is simply there are no human societies that didn't know that you could that pregnancy or the sex caused pregnancy, intercourse caused pregnancy.
sure.
Interestingly enough, aware of this of the work done by Bachofen, natural philosophers who are the predecessors of scientists today in the 19th century would go to tribes and they would say, in all seriousness, to men, adult men and women, how were babies made? Okay. And there are documented cases of entire tribes trolling the natural philosophers and telling them they didn't know how babies were made.
Right. It was a stork. It was the stork, right?
It's great, isn't it? They must have heard about it from other tribes and knew these guys were coming, right? I mean, you just imagine before they turn, they're like, okay, everyone remember, we don't know how babies are made. And they've gone and told these guys they don't know. And it's reinforced these ideas. So, look, it's true. They don't know how babies are made. Yeah, entire tribes were trolling these guys. And they go back and write their articles. Look, it's true. Yeah, they don't know. Yeah. Anyway. Right. So these feminists are buying into all this stuff, which is actually, if you think about it, there's a racist aspect to that, right? Because these guys were looking down on these tribes, right? And the feminists are just completely bought into it.
Well, two things come to mind that I'm going to talk about. So one thing is that, let's assume that this matriarch, this whole thing about understanding male's contribution to the reproductive process was actually true, and men are elevated on that basis. Well, of course, it's like a feminist to complain about, from the nothing that men supposedly was to something, of course, they can't be equals, right?
No, exactly. That's right. That's right. It played into their worldview. Exactly. That's right.
Exactly. And the second one, like I can't help but get reminded of a Gilbert Gottfried joke. I don't know if he originated the joke, but he tells it so well. Of course, I'm not going to imitate his voice, but he said, a little boy asks his mother, "Mom, where do babies come from?" The mom says, "Oh, a stork brings it up, brings the baby," and then they come from the stork, right? And then the boy says, "Yeah, who fucks the stork?"
Nice. Yeah. I've never heard that one.
Right. Yeah, it is funnier when Gilbert Gottfried tells it, so I think you can find it online somewhere. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that's the ancient matriarchy, and as I will concede that even most feminists today admit that it's complete tosh. But it took them a while. Yes, recently as the 1990s, it was pretty common for feminists to actually believe this was true.
Right.
There are ancient. There's ancient sculptures that exist, like the Woman of Willendorf is one very well known one, and they're kind of naked female figures. Although interestingly enough,
the Venus of Willendorf, the Venus of Willendorf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So some people have argued that they were venerating women, but there's another argument that they were kind of just early porn. So
I'm more. I'm more towards that one. They're objects of fun. Yeah, like which
and they have very accentuated vulvas and breasts, which is probably not something you would see on a figure being venerated so much. Although they argue that with often the feminist focus on sex, I think they were assuming that meant veneration. But yeah, I think that increasingly there's an argument that it's probably porn related. Absolutely, or as I say, maybe a figure of fun or something like that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I have to say that I have really interesting particular tastes. That's a very acquired taste to have the Venus of Willendorf as a porn object.
Yes, and they're often the ones I've seen are quite rounded too, which is interesting. They're not sort of slim figures of women.
Well, that's what I was trying to take.
I see what you mean. Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's
right. I've heard some kind of things in which like Egyptian culture, like somewhat modern Egyptian culture, see more rounded women as more attractive, like as a difference of beauty standards or something. I don't know if that's true or not. I just heard something about it.
I've heard that claim for Pacific Island communities as well. I don't know how true it is.
Right.
But yes, the claim's certainly been raised, and I even heard that claim before feminism really exploded in the 90s. Even earlier than that, I heard there were different beauty standards. So it may be true, and it may be that ancient Indo-Europeans or whatever viewed a more plump woman as something that was very attractive, because perhaps that meant wealth too, and that she could afford lots of food.
Right. Well, one thing that's coming to mind is if we flip this thing around, like in places like North Korea, this is stuff I've learned from hearing Yeonmi Park, the refugee, talk about.
She's
in
a
some
North
interviews.
Korean defector who's become
Defector,
quite
right?
famous, isn't she?
Yeah. She's made anecdotes about what's his name? Who's the one that's current? Kim
Kim
Jong-un? Yeah,
Kim
right.
Jong-un, yeah.
Like, well, using him as an example, North Korean women kind of tended to see rounded men as a sign of both wealthiness and attractiveness, because they were so probably well fed and their resources were good and such. So on that basis, they were kind of viewed as handsome.
And certainly in a North Korean context, I could absolutely understand why that's the case.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
Yes. And in fact, that argument probably does make more sense for men than for women, actually.
I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is why
I hadn't heard her mention that, but that's actually really interesting.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's changing it's changing the definitions of what is attractive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, I think it was Yeonmi Park, because there's other defectors out there, and so maybe it was their anecdotes and such. But because I
would be surprised if a number of them mentioned something like that. Actually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the next one is oppression. So I'm going through some of the items I have in the feminist historical narrative. Of course, we touched on this a little bit, where they talk about women being oppressed. And my view, essentially, historically, is that the aristocracy, probably be a fair case to say that the aristocracy oppressed everybody else in the society, but it tended to do so in a gender-neutral manner. So men and women in the aristocracy were living very well. Often the men had higher risks in the aristocracy. They often were in a more likely to be positions of power, but that came with more risk. The women got to enjoy the benefits of that lifestyle without having to take the risk. And they weren't prominent as often, but more often than most people realize. There were more, in most societies, there were more powerful women than most people realize, but they were certainly a minority. But in terms of the lower classes, both men and women, I think it's pretty clear to say, were being oppressed by the aristocracy in their society in general.
That makes sense.
And it was not gendered. I don't know if there's much more I probably want to say on that one, because it's something we talk about quite a lot. Mm-hmm. There's one item I'll probably really quickly mention. It's one of the, I think this may be the first time I've actually mentioned it, but it's one of the ideas that I developed actually while I've been writing the book. I came to realize, I kept coming across these women who it seemed like they wanted to sort of act in a man's world, as it were, in a man's role. And the men around them just went, yeah, okay. It's quite amazing. It really goes against the feminist historical narrative. It seems to be, and this is one of the arguments I'm going to be making in the book, it seems to be that if women want to take that more active role, by and large, men in the society tended to allow them. Now, I might concede that they might only do that for women who seem to be competent, but I would be surprised if that's the case. But for women who are competent, then they wanted to take a more active role, they did. Like, I'll give Joan of Arc is a classic example. This is just a young girl, and she was having visions, which today we would probably ascribe to mental illness. And, she ended up getting to meet the king, and she led an army in battle. Not that she generally actually led, as in commanded the army. She did actually command a military force at one point, but most of the time she was just present on the battlefield. And the men actually really, because they viewed her as sort of, divinely inspired, they tended to view her presence on the battlefield as very important, and it gave them a lot of more and boosted the morale. But so she didn't actually lead men into battle, as is often claimed, except on a couple of occasions later on in her career. And but mostly she just stood there on the battlefield and sort of raised morale. Mm-hmm. But another case I've just come across, Flora Sanders. Now, she's really interesting. I've only come across her in the last few days. She was a British nurse, and she was actually, I think she was actually at one point close to the Western Front during World War One, but she wasn't kind of really satisfied with that. She ended up going to Serbia and served there as a nurse for a little while. And then she just approached the a general in the army and said, can I have a rifle and fight in the Serbian army? And he said, sure, and issued her a rifle, and they assigned her a rank. And she ended up by the end of the war, she was a sergeant major, and she stayed in the army and ended up a captain. And this is this woman who just served in the Serbian army, and she just asked to. And the men, and this is a classic example of what I'm talking about. This seems to happen a lot. That the women say, "Can I do this?" And the men, I guess, if she is perceived as competent, they say, "Yes, you can do it." And there she was, and so she served, and she got a number of medals and so forth, and served in the army, and So and then I've got a little bit more. I've got a little bit on Wiki for Men, but I just thought I'd mention a couple of examples there. This is something that seems to happen a surprising amount. And I said I only came up with this idea after when I started researching the book a few years ago.
Right. Well, was there a conflict in Serbia at the time?
Oh, so yeah. So this is World War One. So this is during
One.
So this still fighting on. Because World War One, I don't know if you how you are with World War One history, but it basically started as a result of what happened in Serbia. So the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, and this precipitated a declaration of war by Austria-Hungary on Serbia, which was an independent country at the time. And then Russia was an ally of Serbia, and they declared war. And then France was an ally of Russia, and Germany was an ally of Austria-Hungary, and most of Europe, it was like they all fell. There was like a house of cards falling as all the alliances got triggered. And then the Germans invaded Belgium, and that brought the UK into the war. So it was all started with Serbia.
I see. Now I have a question. How did she survive to make captain?
So, well, that's a good question. So she was apparently fighting, and she had a number of medals. So she was sergeant major by the end of the war, and after the war ended up getting promoted to captain. So she was apparently in combat during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because you can imagine my skepticism, right? How does she, if she is fighting in a war, despite her competence, how did she, of all people, kind of survive the trials and tribulations?
I don't know. I've only just found out about her, so I haven't done a lot more research into it. That's a good question, though, actually. So,
sure. Did so many men die in her place?
I mean, most men do survive. I mean, most soldiers do survive wars.
Well, true.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what unit she was with, actually. I mean, I had kind of assumed she was with infantry, but that may not be true. Maybe she was with artillery or something like that, where they're in the battle, but not necessarily as closely aligned. I have talked about this before, but similar concept, and this has come up again. People know this. People are learning this stuff. I saw somebody else mention this on Twitter recently. I uncovered this a few years ago. Israel drafts women, but it doesn't put them into combat against their will. That much is commonly known.
I know the tweet you're thinking about. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not what is not as well known is that Israel does not put women into infantry units. It puts them into border patrol units, which are still combat units, but they're not frontline infantry units, and they certainly can and do end up in combat, but not to the extent that infantry units are likely to. And they're in actually relatively, I know I did research this a few years ago, but at the time they were in a relatively small number of units. I think it was three battalions. And it seemed to me that if the casualties were too high, it wouldn't be too hard for them to pull these 3 battalions back and, use them as reserve units or something and get the women out of harm's way. So it seems to be that they do keep them in a relatively, at least as of when I checked a few years ago, it was a relatively small number of units that they kept them in, and it would be a fairly contained situation for them if they needed to get women out of harm's way. So it's interesting, actually. Yeah, I'll look into her a little bit more and see exactly what she did during the war. But since she was involved in battle, apparently did have a number of medals. So
exactly. Well, it seems like the only reason that they are admitted to the army is just so they can pose for pictures.
So, in modern situations, that may be the case too. I don't know about her so much. It seems to be that they sort of gave her a rifle and then assigned her somewhere. But Yeah, we do see that in modern battles, modern situations a little bit.
Well, I'm just saying they just don't get deployed or anything like that. They're just there to show off that there's women in the army, but they don't really do anything.
Yeah. The exception is Ethiopia, which really put women into combat against their will. And in actual fact, Ethiopia had open-ended conscription for both men and women.
Let's see.
And some European countries, and maybe others, accepted conscription into the Ethiopian army as a grounds for asylum on the basis that it was open-ended. Now, my suspicion is they granted a lot more women asylum on this basis than men. Haven't proved that, but that is my suspicion. That because most of the cases I've heard of have been granted asylum on this basis, but both men and women got these open-ended conscription notifications. And so basically it said, you're in the Ethiopian army. Sorry, did I say Ethiopian? Sorry, Eritrean. Sorry?
Eritrean.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I did say Ethiopian. Eritrea.
You did, yeah. But
sorry, I meant Eritrean. Sorry. Eritrea broke off from Ethiopia and they fought a war. In actual fact, these Eritrean women were fighting against Ethiopia. Yes. So please excuse me, any Ethiopians that were listening. I meant Eritrea. So, and these open-ended Eritrean conscription notices that they would get were basically said, you're in the army until such time as we don't need you anymore. And there were some people kept in the army for quite a long period of time. So, so there would, and I said there were women who definitely got asylum in Europe and elsewhere, I believe, in relation to these. But I suspect it was, there may have been some men as well, but it did seem to not be women who were getting it. So, anyway, moving on. Misogyny is a great one. And I'm talking about medieval historical misogyny here. They would usually say misogyny, of course, is the hatred or intense dislike of women. The term is massively overused these days to the point of almost being meaningless. Medieval Europe. Now, one of the things, it's hard to talk about the entire world and all different societies that existed, partly because many of them left no historical record. So there are many cases we simply don't know what the societies, how they were, and how they treated their women or their men. But even when we talk about societies we do have historically, it's an enormous amount of information to look at. And this has been one of the reasons the book has taken me this long as well, because I'm looking at a lot of different societies. But if we pick medieval Europe, which is a society we know quite a lot about, they wrote a lot down. Medieval Europe tended to view women as morally superior to men. And this is something that really shines through in their writings. They also believed that the female sex drive was higher than the male sex drive. As you know, I tend to argue that it's comparable to the male sex drive. They tended to view that as higher than the male sex drive. This is actually something that goes back to ancient Greece as well. But they certainly didn't have a negative view of women in medieval Europe. They had a very positive view of women and tended to view women, as I said, as morally superior.
Right.
Many times when they'd argue about women not being in politics, it was because they thought that was beneath women.
Yeah,
it kind of didn't want to get involved. Again, they were allowed. Go on.
Right. Yeah. No. I'm just thinking about recently I saw some stupid tweet by whoever the hell that was. But our friend Peter Ryan responded in kind. Basically, I'm trying to pull it up here. Let's see here. Okay, so this is whoever the hell this is, Sophie Ruby, who so-called Republican against male supremacists. Saying our culture isn't gynocentric. 75% of politicians are men. The majority of billionaires, business owners, most CEOs, and they're still represented in the media. But of course, Peter Ryan, the anti-gynocentrist, says, cites apex fallacy.
Yeah.
Top 0.1% of men do not represent the 99.9, etc. The reason I bring this up is because they always make these feminists make these apex fallacy things, right. But the thing is, they're always going by the context that being a public servant is such a sacred institution. It's such a position of prestige, but then we have what you just divulged that they knew politics was bullshit, and they just stuck men with the dirty work.
That's right, exactly. And this is and it is especially in medieval Europe, it was relatively high risk being involved and being in the front line, as it were, in terms of if you were a lord or something, and you were you might be leading armies in battle and so forth. And there were risks even that politicians don't have today. And this is how they viewed it. That they said often women were above that sort of thing. So, and I said, and time again, if women wanted to get involved, they were allowed to. So, anyway, Purple Boats is a site I've mentioned a couple of times on Twitter recently. There's some really good stuff there. We've got permission at A Voice for Men to reproduce that material, and we do periodically reproduce the material where it's relevant to what we're talking about. I'm hoping to go through and pretty much capture all the articles that are on Purple Boats that relate to our stuff and republish them. That's probably going to take a while because there's quite a lot, but there's some really good stuff on there. There's also some interesting stuff about the historical views of female sex drive and so forth, which are quite interesting. So,
right.
The next one is patriarchy on my list. Again, this is one we talk about a lot. I think I alluded to this a little bit before. When people talk about when they talk about patriarchy and they make references to this or that, and even say things like the fact that children's names came from the father is patriarchy. It's not. It's actually patrilineal. So, and the more I've looked at this, the more I've realized that most of the things they claim are patriarchal are actually patrilineal. So there's something about this patrilineality, which is descent through the line. Could be power, could be inherit wealth, it could be inherit authority through a kingship or something like that. There's patrifocality, which is a society which is focused on men, as contrasted by a society which is focused on men, matrifocal. And there's patrilocality, which is where they tend to relocate to the man's house. So Western civilization tends to be patrilocal. Not all of them, but let's say Western Europe is patrilocal, where women will move into their husband's house, historically. There are many societies that are matrilocal, where the husband would move into to the wife's house. There are many societies that are matrilineal. Ancient Egypt was matrilineal. So wealth and power descended down the female line. It was men who generally wielded the power, but it descended down the female line. This is why so many pharaohs married their sisters, by the way, because if you're a man's pharaoh, his oldest daughter's husband is going to be the next pharaoh, right? And so a lot of these pharaohs wanted their own sons to be pharaoh, and the way to do that was to marry them off to the sister, because it was his oldest daughter's husband who was the next pharaoh. And so that's how you end up with so much inbreeding in matrilineal societies. Tend to have this problem. They tend to have a lot of inbreeding in the aristocracy, because people keep marrying brothers and sisters together to keep the power down the male line. So anyway, and there are matrifocal, matrilocal, and matrilineal. So the three that there are, and you can find. There are many combinations of this all around the world. But Western European civilization tends to be patrilineal, or historically has been patrilineal, which is why you see wealth and power inherit down the male line, and why you see names inherit down the parent line. That's not just another word for patriarchy. Patrilineal means something very specific, and we've got information on this. I've actually realized there isn't enough information on Wiki for Men on this, and I'm going to be correcting that. But I do have information in some of my presentations and so forth. So,
okay, sounds good. Not only that the females supposedly have a slightly more higher sex drive, they're even more squickier when it comes to this kind of thing, and more prone to that sort of thing.
It's interesting with this essentially throwing away patrilineality too, what effect that will have on the society. The next one I wanted to mention was suffrage, which again is one we've talked about a lot. Just a quick summary. Generally speaking, if a country became independent in the 20th or 21st century, men and women got the vote at the same time. If it became independent in the 19th century, men got the vote a little bit before women, usually often only a few years, sometimes a few decades. It's a lot less than is generally claimed. There's a list of countries on Wikipedia. It's terrible. It's poorly defined. The definitions are all over the place. They're redefining some of it. Absolutely awful. Wiki for Men, I spent quite a bit of time developing a list of our own with a very clear definition of what represents male suffrage and female suffrage. I'd highly recommend everyone use the Wiki for Men reference, not just because I wrote it, but because it's got very strict definitions versus the one on Wikipedia, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And I do detail on Wiki for Men in some cases what is specifically wrong with the Wikipedia definitions. So basically that's suffrage is something that is relatively new. The idea that someone's going to have an inherent right to vote is something that's quite new, with the exception of ancient Athens and one or two other examples. It's something that was pretty revolutionary when it came up in the late 19th century. Men got the vote in countries independent at that time for a short period of time, and then women got the vote as well. The UK being a particularly notable example, where men didn't get, about a third of the men who were drafted to go to World War I wouldn't vote for the government that sent them. And men didn't get universal suffrage until 1918 in the UK, and women 10 years later in 1928. And if you listen to the BBC in 2018, they were constantly talking about universal women's suffrage, when in actual fact that was 100 years of universal men's suffrage in the UK. So missed opportunity there, BBC. We wanted to talk about women's suffrage, and you will again in 2028. So when 2028 comes around, we will find the BBC constantly talking about universal women's suffrage again.
Yep.
At least in 2028, it'll actually be 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we call the crusade of the unopposed, or what I call it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the next one is wealth and power. So there were a lot of, this touches back on a lot of the stuff we're already talking about. There were a lot of powerful women and very wealthy women. One that I've added to Wiki for Men just recently is Anne Lister. She was a diarist, famous for a series of revelations that came out after she died, actually, because she'd written her diaries in a code, not all of which have been translated, I understand. But she was, I think she's a walking counter-argument to the feminist historical narrative. She was a lesbian. She had lesbian affairs all across Europe. She was educated. She owned land and mines, and in the mines she exploited men, women, and children. And in actual fact, after she died, it came out just how many women and children were working in her mines. And that was it wasn't just her, but that was one of the drivers for the UK government passing a law banning women and children working underground. And it was banned. It was actually, the law was passed 2 years after she died. And it came out because her diaries were discovered, and then they found it wasn't not just her mines, but they found women and children working underground in her mines, and that was unacceptable to people of her day. And they banned it. So, as I said, I think she's a walking counterexample to the feminist historical narrative.
Exactly. Yep.
That's probably about all I have. And I've done most of the talking tonight.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the way it usually is, right? I mean, it's really early for me, so I kind of had to go by reactions alone most of the time.
And of course, we've got some plans down the road for some guests as well.
Yeah,
that'll be fun too, actually. So looking forward to that.
Right. Yeah. Now, I will say that, some people might be wondering, am I going to be doing any new videos of my own that's not the goalpost? Well, now that I moved and, the stressors in my life are kind of gone, and once I've settled in, I got some ideas for stuff down the line. So just watch out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. I'm actually going to be doing a few other videos as well. I'm actually going to I'm just going to be reading some of my articles, actually, because I find that so there's sort of, I guess, two different sets of people. Some people prefer to read, and some people prefer to listen and watch videos. And I think I'm going to take those articles, just read them, and then that'll provide that information to a broader audience, hopefully.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you very much. I think our episode's been quite good tonight.
I thought so. Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah, sure. All right. See you, Rob.
Bye.
Bye.